Standard psychological assessments, such as the Big Five, categorize a person's temperament across five static dimensions: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. These models identify the traits a subject already possesses. They do not map the trajectory of how that person's central focus changes over time. To understand the evolution of the self, we look to the framework developed by Olavo de Carvalho. He proposed the human personality is constructed through 12 distinct stages. In this model, moving to a new layer involves the structural reorganization of the existing personality. The individual's basic traits remain the same, but the entire system is directed toward a new, specific existential objective. This creates a diagnostic challenge. You cannot determine an individual's true developmental stage by looking at their social standing or professional title. An adult in a high-status position may still operate from an early, arrested psychological state. To find a subject's true position in this hierarchy, the clinician looks for a specific index of psychological pain. To understand who someone is, you must ask, where exactly does it hurt? Personality development is driven by an ongoing confrontation with escalating forms of suffering. Avoiding the pain specific to a higher layer stops the natural evolution of the self. The model begins with biological determinism. Layers 1 and 2 comprise the physical body and the hereditary constitution. This includes the deep-seated drives mapped by Sondi's typologies. Sondi's typology is a method of psychological profiling using photographic choices to identify inherited, latent drives. At this stage, the subject is a biological product. Layer 3 creates the first rupture in that biological baseline. Through cognition and language, the individual begins to interact with an external environment that requires active interpretation. This is the domain of Jean Piaget's cognitive development stages. Piaget's framework maps how children build mental models of the world through distinct phases of learning. Here, the psyche begins to process external logic. The suffering in Layer 3 is the frustration of cognitive failure, the irritation of failing to master a concept or a physical skill. This pain is immediate and specific, but it is transient and leaves no deep trauma. Successfully navigating these early frustrations is necessary. It provides the communicative tools required to survive the complex, trauma-prone affective stages that follow. Layer 4 brings the subject into their affective history, a domain governed by the models of Sigmund Freud and Melanie Klein. These psychoanalytic schools focus on how early childhood emotional experiences and relationships shape adult behavioral patterns. Here, the subject first discovers happiness or deep sorrow within their family environment. The suffering in Layer 4 is the realization of being unloved or rejected. Individuals who remain at this stage are driven primarily by the need to secure external affection. When this arrest persists into adulthood, the subject demands a level of unconditional love that everyday reality cannot provide. Resolving these infantile needs often requires an artificial psychotherapeutic environment. Moving forward requires the transition to Layer 5, the realm of the ego and individuation. This reflects Carl Jung's school of analytical psychology. Jung's individuation is the process by which an individual develops a distinct autonomous self. The subject must stop looking for external affection and begin testing their own power. The suffering shifts to self-deprecation regarding personal capacity. The pain comes from wanting to act, but lacking the internal power to achieve a goal. This stage explains why a healthy adolescent often acts with arrogance and rejects parental affection. They are intentionally isolating themselves to measure the boundaries of their own capabilities. Successful entry into Layer 5 establishes an active ego. The subject now measures their worth against internal power, rather than the external validation found in Layer 4. In Layer 6, this internal testing is directed toward objective, material results. This is the stage of mastering a trade and earning a salary. The suffering is now objective. It is the pain of material failure or professional incompetence.
These problems are divorced from the psychological neuroses of earlier stages. Material competence allows the individual to enter Layer 7, social roles. This aligns with Alfred Adler's concept of social interest. Adler's theory states that individual well-being depends on active cooperation and contribution to the community. the subject integrates into a system of mutual expectations and duties. Layer 7 redefines love as the fulfillment of duty. It is no longer an emotional demand, but the sacrificial fulfillment of an obligation toward another person. A father who works to support his family is performing an act of love through his social role. The suffering here is the disorientation that occurs when the social contract fails, either because the individual neglects their duty or because society does not reciprocate their efforts. Stability in these roles leads to Layer 8, individual synthesis. This is mapped by René Lassen's characterology. Lassen's characterology is a system that classifies personality based on the long-term stabilization of a person's emotional and active tendencies. The suffering in Layer 8 is a deep self-judgment. After establishing a career and a social role, the subject looks at their life as a whole and asks, "What have I done with my time?" This crisis only appears after a social identity is fully formed. Completing Phase 3 anchors the personality in objective reality. The self has evolved into a functional, accountable node within the societal structure. Most development ends at Layer 8, but the framework includes transcendent tiers. Layers 9 and 10 introduce the transcendental ego, referencing Immanuel Kant's concept of a universal moral reason. Kant's transcendental ego is the philosophical idea of an underlying consciousness that acts according to universal laws applicable to all of humanity. Layer 11 is the historical character, with Napoleon Bonaparte as the archetype. His actions were not driven by social status, but by an experimental drive to test the absolute limits of human agency on the course of history. The final stage is Layer 12, Final Destiny, guided by the existential psychology of Viktor Frankl. Frankl's logotherapy is a psychological school centered on the human search for ultimate meaning, even in the face of inevitable suffering and death. Mahatma Gandhi frequently halted major political movements or fasted to the point of death over minor moral infringements. He placed these metaphysical requirements above the immediate goal of national independence. His behavior suggests a primary dialogue with God rather than a standard political strategy. Action at Layer 12 is supra-historical. The individual is detached from earthly rewards. They would act in the same way even if the world and human history were guaranteed to end tomorrow. The teleology of the human psyche is to transcend biological and social origins, reaching a state where action is dictated solely by universal truth or eternal responsibility. The 12-layer framework follows a specific rhythm. The psyche requires constant oscillation between stages of stabilization and stages of rupture. Integrative layers close the personality, while divisive layers force it to open to external complexities. When an individual fails to meet the demands of a new layer, they do not slide backward. True psychological regression simply does not exist. Instead, the individual engages in a pseudo-passage. In a pseudo-passage, the individual occupies the physical and social space of a higher developmental layer without integrating the psychological substance of the previous stages. They inflate a persona, but the core remains hollow. This creates a diagnostic mismatch. An adult may perform a complex Layer 7 social role, such as a marriage or a career, but they execute it with a Layer 4 motive, the infantile need for affection. Ultimately, this psychological mismatch leads to chronic self-sabotage. The individual destroys their adult relationships because they are demanding unconditional, infantile love from partners who cannot provide it. To analyze human behavior accurately, the clinician must strip away the performance of the social role and find the actual locus of suffering. Growth resumes only when the subject confronts the pain they have been avoiding.